The sun was nasty that day. When the sun's hot rays hit the stones, the earth became a mirror of heat. Tourists grabbed water bottles and covered their eyes as the air shimmered and sweat dripped down their faces. But in the middle of it all, a tomb guard stood still, his eyes fixated on the front, his face set in stone, his white-gloved hand raised in a perfect salute, and his duck boots shined like mirrors. He had been standing there for 5 hours. Not a single step, not a twitch, not a movement. The crowd whispered in disbelief. A man said, "No one can last this long," and another person shook his head and said, "He's going to collapse." A tiny youngster pulled on his mother's sleeve and said, "Mom, why doesn't he stop?" There was no reaction. The guard believed that this was not a show. This was duty. Before we continue, make sure that you are subscribed for more amazing stories and clicked the bell icon. Also let us know in the comments section from where in the world you are watching this from. There was a sound, though, that pierced the silence. The low, snarling rumbling of motorcycles, which started off faint, like distant thunder, and then got louder and closer. Soon the source was clear, a gang of motorcycle riders with engines roaring as they rushed into the sacred area. Their black jackets shone with patches, and their laughing echoed through the air. The crowd's respectful stillness began to fade. Parents pulled their kids closer, veterans grimaced and crossed their arms. When the engines rumbled, it was like a storm hitting a temple. As they got closer to the edge of the grounds, the bikers slowed down. One visitor murmured, "They wouldn't dare," but they did. The sound of their motorcycles hitting the marble made it hard for the audience to hear what they were saying. The guard wasn't like them. They were loud, careless, and not fit. Still, the guard stayed still. He kept his hand in the right place, waving to the heavens. His jaw tightened, but his gaze stayed still and steady. Everyone thought he would go. Even he would give in to the noise, anger, and chaos. But what happened next showed why even the loudest storms may be heard by silence. These motorcyclists weren't just going through. They didn't want to admire. They came to see how strong he was. The test has just begun. The people watching just saw a soldier in uniform standing in the heat, but most people would never know the story behind that salute. Michael Carter was a soldier, brother, and son, who was 34 years old. He had already given up portions of himself in conflicts far away. Michael didn't always see himself as a tomb guard when he was a kid. In the little community where he grew up, serving in the military was more than simply a tradition, and flags were flown on porches. It was almost meant to be. His younger brother Daniel had pushed him the hardest, but his father and grandfather had also served. Daniel was the first to sign up. He was the brave and daring one. Michael went along because he didn't want his brother to go into danger alone, not because he had to. The two brothers fought together in the hot desert of a faraway country, till the day Daniel didn't come back and Michael did. It seemed like nothing could heal the hole that loss had left in him. For months he hadn't been able to sleep. Every loud noise made him think of shooting. Every time there was silence, he thought about how his brother's laughter would never come back. He thought about leaving the service, going back to normal life, and forgetting everything. Still, he headed to Arlington after that. He looked at the place where silence itself became sacred, encircled by many white markers, and a promise came to him. If he couldn't bring Daniel and the other fallen troops back, he would protect their memory. This is how Michael Carter became a tomb guard. The training never stopped. Walking in perfect time, they spent hours learning every rule, custom, and tradition that had been around for decades. Guards were not allowed to break character. Nothing could bother them, not even heat, snow, rain, or scorn. Michael saw their discipline of quiet as a lifeline, not a job. Everyone saluted Daniel. There was a soft voice that said, "You are not forgotten," every hour of silence. But Michael had more than just his own past with him on that hot afternoon. He was carrying the weight of a place that meant a lot more than he did. Arlington National Cemetery was a really impressive sight for visitors. Veterans thought of it as holy ground. It was home to more than 400,000 soldiers. Every stone tells a story, and every grave is a sacrifice. And in the middle was the grave of the unknown soldier, which was watched over day and night, no matter what was going on. There was more to this than just grass and stone. It was the very essence of honor. Michael stood still even though his muscles were screaming, and his eyes were burning from sweat. He wasn't saluting because of the applause. He wasn't saying hello to the tourists. He was paying respect to all the voices that could no longer speak, and the bikers rode into this sacred quiet. People in the nearby towns knew a lot about the gang. They didn't only ride bikes for fun, they had an air of superiority that made others pay attention. Their coats were covered in patches, skulls, and writing that made fun of authority. Some people said they were tied to bars in the area, while others said they were connected to legal problems. But more than anything else, they loved making fun of things that other people cared about. When they found out that a guard had been standing in the heat for hours, their interest turned into a challenge. They thought that this was the best method to show that the whole thing was a fake. They thought the tomb guard was just a man in uniform, like a toy soldier who was too stiff to protect himself, instead of a sign of sacrifice. They thought it would be funny to break his concentration and show the audience that noise and arrogance could breach stillness. It was funny to them, but it would be an insult to the veterans in the audience. A group of older men waited quietly on the stairs near the god, carrying caps with the names of wars that had happened long ago, such Korea, Vietnam, and Iraq. They was scared when the motorcycles got louder. These men knew what it meant to serve, to mourn friends, and to carry the pain of loss like a scar that no one could see at home. Tourists had a hard time with their cameras, not knowing if they were about to see something amazing or something terrible. A mother nearby pulled her child closer and whispered, "This is hallowed ground, don't forget that." Michael Carter stayed still the whole time, his salute steady, his jaw set, and his thoughts focused. Daniel's last words before the explosion took him away. Daniel singing off-key while on patrol, and Daniel making jokes in the barracks all came back to me. The roar of the motorcycles was more than simply noise. His discipline and the vow he made to his brother were both put to the test. And what would it mean for the vow he made if he broke it now even once, even for a second? He wouldn't move now. The motorcycles came closer, their tires crunching on the stone and their engines howling. Their leader smiled and threw his cigarette on the ground while keeping his eyes on the guard. The people in the audience got tense. The fists of veterans got tighter. Kids stood behind their parents. The test was going on, and the world was about to see what happens when pride and honor clash. The motorcyclists didn't just show up out of the blue. They disrupted the quiet. Engines rumbled like thunder. As the party slowed to a crawl and walked around the sacred walkway, their boots scuffed on the stone. Their laughter echoed in the still air. It looked like anarchy had taken over a cathedral. People who came put down their cameras. Parents pulled their kids behind them. As the veterans got nervous, their jaws became as hard as stone. But Michael Carter, the guard at the tomb, wouldn't budge. A perfect stance, eyes locked, and a white-gloved hand lifted in greeting. He had been trained for this. This was what he had always wanted. But the bikers didn't like him. They wanted to break him. The first gear disrupted the silence. "Hey, boy soldier, how long are you going to play statue?" "What?" The exhaust roared like a challenge as one rider purposefully revved his engine. Just a few inches from the guard's boots, another spat onto the ground. The audience gasped. Michael stayed still as the veterans balled their fists. He clenched his jaw. Indeed, a drop of sweat ran down his cheek, but he kept saluting. That only gave them more energy. One snarled, "I bet he's too scared to blink. Observe him." Another person shook his head in a contemptuous way and said, "Man is just a puppet." Their loud, harsh laughter echoed off the marble walls. The minutes dragged on, and each one felt like a bigger burden than the last. The motorcyclists got angry and rode closer, making more noise as they taunted. One of them opened a beer can with a metallic sound, drank it, and then dropped it on the stone. He smiled at the guard who wasn't talking as he stepped on the can and smashed it. The crowd was quite angry. "Disgraceful," a veteran with a faded cap said in a low voice, shaking his hands as he gripped his cane. A little kid said to his mom, "Why are they being mean to him?" She told him to be quiet in a loud voice and looked at the guard. The bikers didn't care. They thrived on the pain and worry they caused. Another motorcyclist leaned forward on his handlebars and said hurtful things like, "You think you're a hero? You're nothing." Michael didn't say anything, which was even worse, just standing there like an idiot. Every taunt, jeer, and disgusting chuckle was met with silence. It wasn't a sign of weakness, it was rebellion, and they were angry at that quiet. Finally the leader, a huge man with a jagged scar on his cheek, decided to keep going. He got off his bike, turned off the engine, and walked ahead. The sound of his heavy boots echoed off the stone. The audience held its breath. He circled Michael like a predator and stopped a few steps away. "What are you protecting?" he asked. He laughed as he looked at the grave behind him. "Just a stone box. Do you think that means anything?" People in the crowd started to gasp. The soldiers thought those comments were not only rude but also blasphemous. A man in his 60s with anger in his eyes stepped up, but his wife grabbed his arm and said, "No, don't." The guard stood still and saluted. The biker leaned in and added, "Bet your brother's in one of these graves." "Too far," the crowd yelled. "I bet he's rotting under your feet right now. Terrible. Leave him alone." But Michael stayed still. He shook his jaw for a second and his eyes flashed with sadness for a second, but he kept his palm up. He stayed in line. The leader smiled because he was happy. "You see, that's just a mannequin." The bikers got bolder. One drove his motorcycle dangerously close as he went around the guard. Another threw a crumpled wrapper at his feet. The goal of each deed was to bring someone down. Everything they did was meant to get a reaction. But stillness was still their adversary. Then the crowd began to pay attention, first in whispers, then in murmurs, and then in something stronger. As one veteran said, "Look at him, still standing, still saluting," while another woman whispered, "He's not moving, not even for them." The crowd began to respect him more. Yes, the motorcyclists were loud, but the guard's quiet was even stronger. The minutes went by very slowly. The sun got stronger. Michael's uniform was dripping with sweat, yet his posture was perfect. The bikers were getting antsy. Their teasing didn't work. There was no point to their noise. The leader's voice got louder as he growled, "Hey, army boy, do you think you're better than us? Do you think standing there shows your strength?" Nothing has changed. The leader's smile transformed into a frown. "All right." He held out his hand only inches from the guard's shoulder and said, "Let's see if you can stand when I make you move." The crowd gasped again, and several yelled for him to stop. Parents kept their youngsters' eyes safe. The veterans mumbled prayers. Michael didn't move as the biker's fingers hovered, shaking with excitement at the thought of touching him. But beneath that severe facade, his pulse was pounding, not with fear, but with thoughts of Daniel's bravery, humor, and sacrifice. Michael had promised himself that he would never flinch, hesitate, or forget. A biker's push, an insult, or a torrent of derision wouldn't break it. He wasn't weak for not saying anything. It was strength. It was a sign of respect. The silence was filled with memories of his brother. The leader's hand slid to his side for a moment, but the harm was done. Someone had gone too far. It was the most stressful time. The crowd stood quietly. The veterans' eyes were on fire. The kids clung on to their parents. Everyone in the world held their breath. Michael Carter did not move, even though the sun was shining brightly all the while. 5 hours of heat, abuse, and provocation had put him to the ultimate test. But he was quiet, still, and immobile like a rock. The revving engines of the bikers as they got closer added to the suspense. There was a lot of swearing, teasing, and laughing in the air. Finally, the leader, who had a deep scar across his cheek, crossed over. As he walked, his boots hit the stone. His hand shot out and pushed Michael's shoulder, just enough to challenge the guy under the salute and make the uniform angry. The audience gasped all at once. A curtain of silence fell. The kids clutched onto their moms. People who came froze. Their hands shook as they held cameras. For a moment, the veterans' jaws were so tight that it looked like the stone of Arlington had crept into their bodies. Michael hesitated for a moment as memories of the struggle, the cries of his slain comrades, and the disappearance of his brother Daniel came flooding back. It wasn't out of respect or fear. It was more than just a push. It was a symbolic attack on all of his past pledges. Then he moved, but not like everyone thought he would. Slowly, carefully, with each step planned out. The leader looked icy and uncompromising, like a tempest trapped in a human body. He turned his head toward the motorcycle and stared at him. The crowd could feel the change right away. The bikers could feel it too. The weight of discipline, dignity, and tradition pressing down on them like an invisible hand. "Step back." Michael's soft, low voice shattered the tension. It wasn't a challenge, a threat, or a plea. They were in charge, and the heavy weight of sacrifice and years of training made them that way. The person on the motorcycle stopped. His puff of smoke wavered. He held back a laugh. The sound of pure discipline seemed to echo through the air. Everyone who saw it, including kids and tourists, could feel it. There was no sound, but something living, strong, and terrifyingly beautiful had taken its place. The leader frowned and took a step back, but he wasn't as determined as he had been. Bicyclists gazed at each other with worry. It showed the imbalance for the first time. The guard was more than just a man. He was a real-life example of dedication, hard work, and the spiritual duty that everyone could respect but few understood. The nervous throng began to breathe normally again. "Have you heard that?" a faint voice asked. He followed his orders and took a step back, and Michael's hand stayed up in a perfect salute. He stayed in the same position. The shove hadn't shaken him. It had only made the power that radiated from his silence stronger. The leader's face turned red with a mix of anger, embarrassment, and confusion. He started to respond, but the crowd's weight, the guard's steady discipline, and the veteran's looks stopped him. The slightest movements were amplified. "That's more power than 1,000 guns," said a veteran, while a child murmured, "He's like a superhero." The guard's gaze briefly shifted to the tomb behind him. He was reminded of his commitment by every tombstone and marker, his brother, his fellow warriors, the unidentified heroes who received everything. Michael's answer reflected the fact that the sacrifices engraved on that sacred land were far more significant than the biker's shove. Noise could be drowned out by silence, arrogance could be crushed by discipline, the undeserving could be degraded by honor without a single strike. The leader stepped back again, getting away from the atmosphere that surrounded Michael Carter as he realized how serious the situation was. His gang followed him reluctantly, their engines idling uneasily. Their goal had been to break him, but they were the ones who were broken, not in a physical sense, but in spirit and will. The spectators were shocked. Phones recorded, cameras clicked. Later, witnesses would describe it as the quiet that shouted louder than turmoil. Michael's hands did not waver. His fingers were perfectly straight and covered in white gloves. Sweat dripped down his temple, but the storm was contained within his eyes like a controlled fire. He wasn't just standing there. He was upholding the unshakable honor principle, which teaches that respect must be earned rather than demanded. Minutes passed. Time seemed to have stopped. The bikers shifted nervously, unsure whether to confront or run. The nervous onlookers moved closer, feeling the climactic pulse of the confrontation. Then Michael turned back to the tomb without saying anything. He gave an unwavering salute. His presence alone made it clear that order persists even when chaos rises, and honor never fades even when people are disrespectful. After losing without throwing a single punch, the motorcyclists finally grumbled to themselves and left, their pride in ruins. The audience let out a collective sigh of relief, wonder, and reverence. The silence that followed was deafening. It was a powerful, meaningful silence. The world learned something important in that silence. Some wars are won without bloodshed. The guard acted out of discipline and commitment, not anger. Certain victories are won only through calmness, bravery, and unwavering moral conviction. A child pulled at his mother's sleeve, and a veteran came forward, eyes sparkling, and murmured to his companion, "I've never seen anything like it, ever. He's a hero, isn't he, Mom?" Sweat-soaked yet determined, Michael Carter refused to turn. He was not smiling, simply keeping his palm up and his eyes forward. He honored the sacred task that had led him here rather than himself. Arlington was more than just a cemetery at that precise moment. It served as evidence. It was full of honor, respect, and the silent strength of one guy who would not give up. The motorcyclists had left. The crowd was quiet. Still, Michael Carter saluted. The air was thick with silence, thicker than the burning sun above. Michael Carter had held his ground for 5 hours, through insults, heat, and now the motorcycle leader's open physical challenge. But the fight was far from over. The bikers, embarrassed but unhurt, mumbled under their breath as they watched the crowd gather. Some looked like they were going to leave, while others said it was a final act of rebellion. But it seems that fate had other plans. A group of Arlington police and security officers came from the edge of the walkway. They had cameras and were ready to step in. They had been watching the chaos. They moved forward after seeing how brave the biker was and how the guard wouldn't move. One officer said in a stern voice, "Sir, you need to step back." The leader laughed nervously, trying to hide the fear in his eyes. "This is restricted ground." "Constrained," he said in a low voice. "We were just admiring," but no one believed him. The officers moved in to keep the group away from the grave. There was a gasp from the audience right after one rider refused and pushed a police officer in uniform. Veterans walked forward without thinking, their presence commanding notice. It didn't take long for the group to be put down. Discipline, the law, and respect took away their strength. Michael Carter, on the other hand, kept standing at attention with his white-gloved hand up in the right way. He didn't look around. He didn't say anything. He went back to the quiet routine that had been part of his work since the first hour of the day. Some people in the crowd held up cameras and filmed the whole scenario, including the bikers running away, the shocked bystanders, and the lone guard. Not bothered, not broken. Don't forget. Live recorded footage of flashing phones quickly went viral on social media. In just a few minutes, a tense confrontation became a viral event. The tomb guard had to deal with 5 hours of chaos. Biker humiliated was trending on local feeds. That man didn't even lift a finger, a veteran said to his companion, tears in his eyes, and still he won. A child held his mother's hand and repeated again, "Mom, he's a real hero." But Michael kept his focus. Every move and gesture stayed perfect, intentional, and holy. He no longer only said hello out of duty. It had come to mean winning by staying quiet. They were being led away with their heads down and their bravado gone. At one point, the leader who had pushed him turned to face him, and his eyes were wide with horror. He thought there would be confusion, surrender, and maybe even fear. Instead, he saw honor that never wavered smiling down at him. The guard's calmness did what threats, shoves, and derision could not. It had shown how weak they were, shamed them in public, and returned honor back to a sacred place. People in the audience clapped around him, first gently and then more loudly. Veterans nodded in accord with a serious look on their faces. The kids smiled shyly. Even tourists were so impressed by what they saw that they murmured to each other. Finally, Michael bowed his head to stare at the grave of the unknown soldier. For one more moment, his hands stayed up in memory of his brother Daniel, who had died, and all the other people who had made sacrifices without being seen or heard. The video that went viral shows more than simply a scuffle. It taught a lesson about self-control, bravery, and the power of quiet determination. "I've never seen such honor" was all over social media. This is what heroes really do. You can't hear violence when it's quiet. There were now more than one story about the event besides Michael Carter's. It was a tribute to respect and loyalty that lasted around the world. Even after the bikers were taken away, rumors of incredulity and shame continued to spread. They had expected chaos, but one man's honesty was enough to defeat them. Michael went back to his place as if nothing had happened. No need to throw a party, smoke, or say anything. The salute, which was a wordless declaration that was louder than any noise, was its own reward. As the crowd started to thin out, veterans quietly moved up to him and saluted him. A young person whispered, "Thank you, sir," in a whisper that was barely heard. Michael bent his head and kept his gaze forward, honoring his duty and the seriousness of the event. The biker's disobedience would not be remembered, but the day would be remembered for the man who was always there and let quiet speak when words could not. It was a peak of virtue instead of aggression, and it was a peak of calm instead of clamor. A fight that was fought in public, morally and decisively, but not with violence. The guards stood up. The bikers were gone. The globe realized that even the loudest storms can be overcome by discipline and honor. While everyone watched in awe, as the sun began to set, deep shadows enveloped the grounds of Arlington. There were only a few veterans left, heads down and hats in hand, for the crowd had left. The motorcyclists were carried away, and their shame was like a heavy weight on them. Michael Carter, on the other hand, stayed with his hands in the salute position, his gaze steady, and his posture perfect. But the time had changed. The purpose of making a point to outsiders had altered. It was a way to honor those who couldn't protect themselves. Time passed. The wind that blew through the cemetery moved the flags that marked the graves of numerous soldiers. Michael's eyes fell on the grave of the unknown soldier. His clothing was soaked, every muscle in his body hurt, and a drop of sweat slid down his cheek. He wanted to sleep so badly, but he stayed still for a little longer. There were footsteps behind them that sounded like they were following a plan. Michael nodded slightly to a man in a spotless uniform who had stopped in front of him. Colonel James Whitaker was there, and his face was serious but courteous. The colonel gave a silent salute. Michael's hands stayed steady as he returned the salute, even though he was tired. It was a quiet way of showing dedication, unbreakable self-control, and honor via both action and inaction. The colonel finally said, "Outstanding," in a loud but quiet voice. "Today you've set a standard that people will remember. Not just here, but far beyond these grounds." Michael nodded but didn't say anything. There was no need for words. His actions had already spoken for themselves. Michael slowly lowered his hand and let his stance relax now that the colonel was gone and he was alone. He took a dog tag out of his pocket, a tattered and faded memento of his brother Daniel. He closed his eyes and held it softly. "Today was dedicated to you, Daniel," he said to himself. "Every hour, every insult, every shove, it was all for you." With a tiny ceremony of remembering surrounding him, he delicately tucked the dog tag into the folds of his uniform. The wind rustling through the trees, the distant echo of footfall, and the subtle hum of life going on around a place devoted to those who had given everything, kept the cemetery quiet but alive. A child's voice broke the silence. The mother smiled through her tears and said, "He's a hero, Mom." Michael didn't turn, but he heard the whisper. The words were gentle but full of truth. Not all acts of heroism are loud. Sometimes they stay quiet and strong. He carefully walked over to a nearby covered bench and sat down quickly. A note from a fellow soldier in his pocket reminded him of the importance of heritage, recollection, and bravery that are passed down from one generation to the next, without anyone saying anything. Michael thought about everything that had led him to this point, including his brother, the soldiers he had served with, the discipline that had shaped him, and the holy ground he now protected. He also thought about the encounter with the motorcyclists. It all led to the same simple conclusion: honor is not done for attention. It is lived in silence, steadily, and without hope of gain. The shadows got longer, and he stood up again, quickly and with purpose, and went back to his place. The world had seen how determined he was. They had shown the bikers, but his victory was eternal, sacred, and personal. He felt a strong connection to his brother, who had died, and to the living who now understood in that silence. The power of unflinching honor at that moment. Michael Carter stayed focused. Everything around him changed. He fought as a quiet defender of honor, bravery, and legacy, even when things were crazy. Sometimes silence speaks louder than noise. When force doesn't work, discipline can win. And honor exists without recognition. Michael Carter's Arlington stand was more than one act. It was a test of respect, bravery, and humanity. He showed that true power comes from self-control, unshakable determination, and the courage to stay still while everything around you tries to bother you. This is different from a society that often encourages noise, chaos, and confrontation. The motorcyclists came expecting conflict, weakness, and submission, but instead they found a man whose determination was stronger than the sun, deeper than threats, and more powerful than mockery. And while they watched in awe, the audience saw something that words can't describe. Bravery isn't always easy to see. Sometimes it could be quietly rebellious. When the video went viral, millions of people around the world saw what Arlington had always known: that discipline is power, that sacred duty is eternal, and that one person standing strong may inspire others without ever raising an angry hand. The act was also personal to Michael, for his brother, for all the dead soldiers, and for the legacy he promised to protect. He showed that honesty always wins over chaos, and that silence can speak louder than storms. One lesson to take away from this story is that bravery isn't always loud. Sometimes it changes the world by standing still, unwavering and unflinching. So remember this: when the world tests you, when things seem impossible, and when people doubt your abilities, stay strong, be patient, be disciplined, and let your actions speak for you, whether they are loud or quiet. Honor those